When I walk through the galleries of contemporary art museums, I am struck not by beauty or truth, but by the deliberate rejection of both. The fractured canvases, the nihilistic installations, the celebration of ugliness masquerading as sophistication, these are not merely aesthetic choices, but symptoms of a deeper cultural malady. What we call modern art is, in many respects, the artistic expression of a civilization that has lost its moorings in the permanent things. For decades in my study at Piety Hill, I have observed how the corruption of artistic imagination parallels the decay of moral imagination in our society. Art, which once served to elevate the human spirit toward transcendent beauty, now functions as an instrument of cultural destruction. This is not mere conservatism speaking, but the voice of one who has witnessed how the abandonment of traditional forms in art mirrors the abandonment of traditional wisdom in politics, education, and social life. The question before us is not whether we prefer Rembrandt to Pollock, but whether we understand that the health of artistic imagination reflects the health of civilization itself. Through my fiction, in works like Old House of Fear, I have explored how the forces of modernization threaten to destroy the very foundations of traditional communities, and this same destructive force manifests itself most visibly in contemporary artistic expression. The modern rejection of beauty represents nothing less than a rejection of the transcendent order that gives human life its meaning and purpose. Chapter 1: The Moral Imagination in Traditional Art. Throughout the centuries of Western civilization, art served as a bridge between the material and the spiritual, between the temporal and the eternal. The great masters, Michelangelo, Raphael, Caravaggio, understood that their craft was not merely technical skill, but a sacred vocation to reveal divine beauty through human creativity. When Michelangelo painted the Sistine Chapel ceiling, he was not expressing his subjective feelings or rebelling against artistic conventions. He was participating in the cosmic order by making visible the invisible truths of creation. This is what I call the moral imagination at work in art, the capacity to perceive and express the transcendent meaning that underlies human experience. Traditional art operated within what Edmund Burke recognized as the sublime and the beautiful, categories that connect aesthetic experience to moral and spiritual reality. The medieval cathedral builders, the Renaissance painters, even the portraitists of the 18th century understood that their work served a purpose beyond self-expression, the cultivation of souls and the preservation of cultural memory. Their art was didactic in the highest sense, teaching viewers to see beyond the surface of things to the eternal principles that govern human existence. Consider the difference between a Gothic cathedral and a modern glass box of an office building. The cathedral, with its soaring arches and intricate stonework, draws the eye and the soul upward, symbolizing humanity's aspiration toward the divine. Every detail, from the placement of windows to the progression of architectural elements, serves this transcendent purpose. The modern building, by contrast, celebrates functionality stripped of meaning, efficiency divorced from beauty, utility without reference to any higher purpose. This transformation in artistic sensibility reflects a broader cultural shift from what T.S. Eliot called the dissociation of sensibility, the separation of thought from feeling, reason from imagination, the material from the spiritual. When art loses its connection to transcendent reality, it inevitably becomes either mere decoration or deliberate iconoclasm. The former produces the sentimentality that plagues much commercial art. The latter produces the nihilistic rebellion that characterizes much avant-garde expression. The moral imagination that animated traditional art understood that beauty serves a function beyond mere pleasure. It connects the human soul to the divine order that underlies all creation. This is why the destruction of beautiful things has always been one of the first acts of revolutionary movements, from the iconoclasts of Byzantium to the cultural revolutionaries of our own time. Chapter 2: The Revolution Against Beauty. The assault on traditional artistic forms began in earnest during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, coinciding with what I have observed to be the broader ideological assault on Western civilization itself. The Dadaists, the Surrealists, the abstract expressionists, all proclaimed their rebellion not merely against artistic conventions, but against the very notion that art should embody beauty, truth, or moral purpose. Marcel Duchamp's infamous Urinal, displayed as art in 1917, was not a playful gesture but a deliberate desecration of the artistic tradition that had sustained Western culture for millennia. This revolution against beauty parallels the political revolutions that have characterized modern history. Just as the French revolutionaries sought to create a new man by destroying traditional institutions, modern artists have sought to create a new aesthetic by destroying traditional forms. Both enterprises spring from the same source, the prideful belief that human beings can create meaning ex nihilo, without reference to the accumulated wisdom of the past or the transcendent order that gives life its purpose. The consequences of this artistic revolution extend far beyond the art world itself. When a culture's artistic imagination becomes corrupted, its capacity for moral imagination necessarily suffers as well. Art has always served as one of the primary means by which societies transmit their deepest values to succeeding generations. The stories told in paintings, the virtues celebrated in sculpture, the harmonies expressed in architecture, these shape the moral sensibilities of those who encounter them. When art abandons its educational and elevational function, it leaves a vacuum that is inevitably filled by more direct forms of ideological indoctrination. Moreover, the rebellion against artistic beauty reflects and reinforces the broader cultural tendency toward relativism. If there are no objective standards of beauty, if artistic value is merely a matter of personal preference or cultural convention, then by extension there can be no objective standards of truth or goodness either. The aesthetic relativism that declares a Jackson Pollock canvas as valuable as a Vermeer painting prepares the ground for the moral relativism that sees no meaningful distinction between virtue and vice, between civilization and barbarism. The modern artist, having rejected the disciplined study of traditional forms, finds himself in the position of the barbarian who must constantly innovate because he has no cultural inheritance to draw upon. This produces the restless novelty-seeking that characterizes much contemporary art, the desperate search for originality that results only in greater degrees of ugliness and meaninglessness. Chapter 3: Tradition as the Democracy of the Dead in Artistic Heritage. When we speak of artistic tradition, we invoke what I have called the democracy of the dead, the wisdom accumulated by countless generations of artists who developed techniques, forms, and aesthetic principles through centuries of patient refinement. This artistic inheritance represents far more than mere convention. It embodies the collective discovery of what serves human flourishing and what connects the human soul to beauty, truth, and transcendent meaning. Consider the development of perspective in Renaissance painting, or the evolution of harmonic principles in Western music, or the refinement of proportional relationships in classical architecture. These were not arbitrary rules imposed by academic authorities, but discoveries about how human perception works, how the eye and the mind respond to certain relationships and patterns. The traditional artist inherited these discoveries and built upon them, contributing his own insights while remaining connected to the broader stream of cultural development. The modern rejection of artistic tradition represents a peculiar form of cultural arrogance, the belief that each generation must start from zero, that the accumulated wisdom of the past has no claim upon the present. This attitude produces what might be called aesthetic democracy, in the worst sense, the notion that an untrained person's artistic judgment is as valid as that of someone who has spent years studying and practicing within the traditional forms. But true artistic democracy, like true political democracy, depends upon the cultivation of educated judgment. The craftsman who has mastered the techniques of drawing, composition, and color theory is better equipped to innovate meaningfully than the amateur who relies solely on inspiration or emotional expression. The musician who understands harmony, counterpoint, and form can explore new musical territory without losing connection to the principles that make music comprehensible and moving to human listeners. This is why I have always insisted that genuine conservatism in art is not mere antiquarianism, but the preservation of those elements of the artistic tradition that serve enduring human needs. The question is not whether artists should slavishly imitate their predecessors, but whether they should work within forms that have proven their capacity to embody and transmit meaning across generations. Innovation that builds upon tradition enriches the cultural inheritance. Innovation that rejects tradition typically produces novelty without significance. In my own literary work, particularly in my supernatural fiction, I have sought to demonstrate how traditional narrative forms can address contemporary concerns while maintaining connection to the permanent things that give human experience its meaning and coherence. Chapter 4: The Transcendent Order and Artistic Purpose. Throughout my years of study, I have observed that the greatest art of every civilization springs from recognition of a transcendent order that gives meaning to human existence. Whether we speak of Egyptian tomb paintings, Gothic manuscripts, Byzantine mosaics, or Renaissance frescoes, the most enduring artistic achievements have been those that attempt to make visible the invisible realm of spiritual reality that lies behind material appearances. This connection between art and transcendence is not merely a historical curiosity, but reflects something fundamental about human nature itself. We are creatures suspended between the material and the spiritual, between time and eternity, and art serves as one of the primary means by which we explore and express this tension. When art loses its connection to transcendent reality, it necessarily becomes either mere naturalistic representation or subjective self-expression, both of which ultimately prove unsatisfying to the deepest human longings. The secular humanism that has dominated intellectual life since the Enlightenment promised that human beings could create meaning without reference to divine authority or transcendent purpose. Modern art represents one of the most ambitious attempts to fulfill this promise, to create beauty, meaning, and spiritual satisfaction through purely human effort, without acknowledgement of any reality beyond the material world. The results speak for themselves: an artistic culture that celebrates ugliness over beauty, chaos over order, destruction over creation. This is not to say that all modern artists are consciously nihilistic or destructive in their intentions. Many are sincere in their search for meaning and their desire to create works of lasting value. But sincerity of intention cannot compensate for fundamental errors in understanding about the nature of reality and the purpose of art. When artists attempt to create meaning without reference to transcendent truth, their work inevitably reflects the limitations and confusions of their own finite perspectives. The recovery of artistic health requires what I would call a renewed sense of cosmic piety, the recognition that human creativity participates in a larger creative order that precedes and encompasses individual artistic effort. This does not mean that all artists must be explicitly religious in their approach, but it does mean that the artistic imagination must be reconnected to what previous generations called the great chain of being, the hierarchical order that connects material reality to spiritual truth. In my critical writings on T.S. Eliot and other literary figures, I have consistently emphasized how the greatest modern artists have been those who maintained some connection to transcendent reality, even when working within forms that reflected contemporary concerns and sensibilities. Chapter 5: Defending Natural Hierarchy Against Cultural Egalitarianism. One of the most destructive aspects of modern artistic culture is its embrace of what might be called aesthetic egalitarianism, the notion that all forms of artistic expression are equally valid, that traditional distinctions between high and low culture are merely prejudices of an elitist establishment. This leveling tendency reflects the broader egalitarian ideology that has infected our educational and cultural institutions, producing what Ortega y Gasset called the revolt of the masses against the principle of excellence itself. True artistic culture has always been hierarchical, recognizing that some works achieve greater beauty, express deeper truths, and demonstrate higher levels of technical mastery than others. This is not a matter of social prejudice but of objective reality. The difference between a Beethoven symphony and popular music, between a Shakespeare play and television drama, between a medieval illuminated manuscript and contemporary graphic design, these differences are real and significant, reflecting varying degrees of artistic achievement and cultural importance. The egalitarian assault on artistic hierarchy manifests itself in several ways: the academic elevation of popular culture to the same level as traditional high culture, the rejection of technical training in favor of self-expression, the celebration of artistic works based on their political message rather than their aesthetic merit, and the general abandonment of quality distinctions in favor of inclusivity and accessibility. This cultural flattening serves neither true democracy nor genuine artistic development. Democracy is best served when citizens are educated to appreciate excellence and when artistic education helps them distinguish between the profound and the trivial, the beautiful and the merely novel. The democratic ideal should be to make the best of human achievement accessible to all, not to reduce all achievement to the lowest common denominator. Moreover, the rejection of artistic hierarchy undermines the very possibility of cultural progress. If we cannot distinguish between better and worse in artistic matters, we have no basis for encouraging the development of talent, preserving the greatest achievements of the past, or aspiring to create works that surpass previous accomplishments. The result is cultural stagnation masquerading as democratic progress. I invite you to consider your own aesthetic experiences. Do you not find that certain works of art move you more deeply, challenge you more significantly, and reward repeated attention more richly than others? This is not a reflection of cultural conditioning but of the natural human capacity to recognize degrees of excellence and meaning in artistic expression. The attempt to suppress this natural capacity in the name of equality results not in genuine democratic culture but in the tyranny of mediocrity. Chapter 6: Political Prudence and the Corruption of Artistic Institutions. The corruption of modern art cannot be understood apart from the broader institutional decay that has affected universities, museums, and cultural foundations throughout the Western world. What began as aesthetic experimentation has become ideological enforcement, as arts institutions increasingly serve not as guardians of cultural heritage but as agents of political transformation. The prudent approach to cultural stewardship requires understanding that institutions, like individual works of art, can serve either constructive or destructive purposes. Museums that once functioned to preserve and transmit the greatest achievements of human artistic endeavor now often present themselves as venues for social activism and political consciousness raising. Universities that once taught students to appreciate the artistic heritage of their civilization now more commonly encourage them to view that heritage with suspicion and contempt. This transformation reflects the triumph of ideological thinking over prudential judgment in cultural matters. Instead of asking what serves the long-term health of artistic culture, institutional leaders ask what advances particular political agendas. Instead of preserving the conditions under which genuine artistic excellence can flourish, they promote forms of expression that serve immediate social and political purposes. The consequences extend far beyond the art world itself. When cultural institutions lose their connection to their proper purposes, they cease to serve as sources of continuity and stability in society. The museum that abandons its educational mission in favor of political advocacy, the university that replaces artistic training with ideological indoctrination, the foundation that funds political activism rather than cultural preservation, all contribute to the broader fragmentation of social authority that characterizes modern life. Prudent cultural policy would recognize that artistic institutions, like political institutions, require careful tending if they are to serve their proper functions across generations. This means resisting both the reactionary impulse to freeze cultural development at some arbitrary point in the past and the radical impulse to abandon all connections to traditional purposes and methods. The recovery of institutional health requires what I would call conservative reform, gradual changes that restore institutions to their proper functions while adapting them to contemporary circumstances. This is neither wholesale rejection of the modern world nor uncritical acceptance of its assumptions, but careful discrimination between what serves human flourishing and what undermines it. In my work on academic freedom and educational reform, I have consistently argued that institutions must serve their proper purposes if they are to contribute to the health of civilization rather than its decay. Chapter 7: The Permanent Things in Artistic Expression. Beneath the changing fashions of artistic style and the fluctuations of cultural taste, certain elements of human artistic expression remain constant across civilizations and centuries. These are what I call the permanent things in art, the enduring principles that connect artistic creativity to the deepest sources of human meaning and that distinguish genuine artistic achievement from mere novelty or self-expression. Among these permanent things, I would identify the human response to beauty as perhaps the most fundamental. Despite all attempts by modern theorists to relativize or deconstruct aesthetic experience, human beings continue to respond powerfully to certain proportions, harmonies, and forms that have moved people across cultures and throughout history. The mathematical relationships that govern musical harmony, the proportional principles that create architectural beauty, the color relationships that produce visual pleasure, these are not cultural conventions but reflections of the order that underlies creation itself. Another permanent element is the human need for meaning and narrative coherence in artistic expression. While modern art often celebrates fragmentation and meaninglessness as sophisticated responses to contemporary experience, the enduring appeal of traditional narrative forms in literature, representational imagery in visual art, and melodic structure in music suggests that human beings require coherent meaning-making frameworks to fully engage with artistic works. The role of technical mastery represents another permanent element. Despite romantic notions about untutored genius and the superiority of emotional expression over learned skill, the greatest artistic achievements have typically combined inspiration with rigorous technical training. The artist who has mastered the tools of his craft is better positioned to express complex meanings and to create works that reward sustained attention than the artist who relies solely on spontaneous expression. Perhaps most importantly, the connection between artistic imagination and moral imagination represents a permanent aspect of human cultural experience. Art that elevates human aspirations, that connects individual experience to universal truths, that inspires reverence for beauty and goodness, such art serves enduring human needs that transcend particular historical circumstances. The recognition of these permanent things does not require rigid adherence to any particular artistic style or historical period, but it does require acknowledgement that some approaches to artistic creation serve human flourishing better than others, and that the wisdom embedded in traditional artistic forms represents genuine discovery about human nature and the conditions of meaningful existence. In my supernatural fiction and critical writings, I have consistently sought to demonstrate how these permanent things operate in literary art, showing how traditional forms can address contemporary concerns while maintaining connection to transcendent meaning. Conclusion. The recovery of artistic health in our time requires neither nostalgic retreat to past forms nor uncritical embrace of contemporary experimentation, but renewed commitment to the permanent things that have always distinguished genuine art from mere fashion or ideology. We must reject the false choice between lifeless traditionalism and destructive innovation, seeking instead the creative fidelity that builds upon inherited wisdom while addressing contemporary needs and circumstances. The artist who understands his place in the great tradition of human creative achievement is better positioned to contribute meaningfully to that tradition than the artist who imagines himself creating meaning from nothing. True conservatism in art, as in politics, seeks to preserve what serves human flourishing while adapting prudently to changing circumstances. The permanent things endure not because they are old, but because they answer to enduring aspects of human nature that no revolution can eliminate. Through my own literary work, whether in supernatural fiction or cultural criticism, I have sought to demonstrate that traditional forms remain viable vehicles for addressing the deepest concerns of human existence. For those willing to cultivate the moral imagination that great art both requires and fosters, the path forward leads not to cultural despair but to renewed participation in the creative order that gives life its meaning and beauty its transcendent significance. The choice before us is clear: we can continue down the path of aesthetic nihilism that leads to cultural death, or we can recover the artistic wisdom that connects human creativity to the permanent things that sustain civilization itself.